Hi, I'm Michael Gourlay. This is a progress update on my game, Love Tanks. This video describes why and how I added hydraulic erosion to the planet where the Love Tanks live. I found the old planet unsatisfying and problematic. I wanted the planet to be more interesting and engaging, and for the world to feel like it has a lot of space. Other games, like Bethesda's open world games, do a great job of making their worlds feel vast even with limited resources. A sense of exploration and discovery would also be a nice side effect. The lighthouse sentiment for Love Tanks is companionship. This goal of wanting an engaging and seemingly vast terrain feeds back to that theme. The player should feel like they have a place their pack can call home. A place where they can rally before patrols and where they can reincarnate. For Love Tanks, I take inspiration from wolf behavior. Each wolf pack has a territory they mark and defend vigilantly. Each pack also establishes dens within their territory where they birth cubs. Establishing a territory should engage players. Maslow's hierarchy of needs eventually leads to creative endeavors. More on this subject in a future update. Meanwhile, I'll just mumble something about structures and terraforming and move on. The old planet had some important problems. The terrain was flat enough that players could drive directly from anywhere to anywhere. Even the steepest hill, any tank could just drive right over. It only took about 3 minutes to circumnavigate the planet, so it felt small. Meanwhile, the terrain was bumpy enough so that the journey was slow and uncomfortable to watch. To create a feeling of larger space, I wanted to break up the terrain in both visibility and navigability. I wanted to distinguish between pathways, such as narrow flat regions, and barriers, such as cliffs and mountains. In nature, terrain forms flat regions from geological processes. One such landform is called an alluvial plain. They form from rivers depositing sediment. The easiest way to form these flat regions would be to apply a transformation curve to the height field to exaggerate peaks and suppress flat regions. It's easy to implement, but when I tried it, I didn't get results I found satisfying. Another option was to simulate hydraulic erosion and deposition. Simulating hydraulic erosion for making artificial terrains is well studied and documented. Sebastian Legue published a YouTube video about how he did this. It's one of my sources of inspiration. If you like indie game development, I recommend you watch his whole channel. All his videos are fun and informative. The basic idea behind hydraulic erosion is straightforward. Water moves downhill, either dissolving or depositing sediment depending on how saturated the water is at each moment. It's easy to find lots of papers on the subject, and many are aimed at fast and simple implementations that strive to look good without worrying too much about geological accuracy. You can even find a version that runs in a web browser, and lots of code is publicly available. I find it easier to diagnose an algorithm if I can form an intuition that lets me reason about how it works. So my code follows more academic approaches based on physical principles rather than the more ad hoc ones that just want to look nice. Also, even though I started with a Lagrangian particle-based approach, I thought I might eventually adopt an Eulerian grid-based approach. So I decided to implement hydraulic erosion as an image processing algorithm. I started with the height field, compute the gradient, compute something like steepest descent pathways except modified by inertia, and a simple evaporation model to influence path length and sediment capacity, and a simple mass-preserving erosion and deposition model. My first attempt was somewhat more physically accurate. I used a subgrid scale simulation with lots of water drops. The results looked good. Lots of alluvial plains developed and mountainsides seemed finely scraped, but the simulation was too slow for live processing. So I profiled the code and sought ways to make it faster. The first thing I noticed is that the algorithm, or rather the simulation, is nonlinear, meaning if you just crank up the erosion, deposition, and capacity parameters, then the simulation speeds up, but you don't just get more of the same. You get something that can be wildly, drastically different. And you can't just increase the step size, because then the simulation violates a CFL condition and the simulation goes unstable. But I like this idea of just having the effect of running the simulation many times without actually having the cost of running it many times. So I rewrote the simulation in a way that each individual drop doesn't influence the other drops that are falling concurrently. So I pre-compute the gradient and I reuse that for multiple paths rather than recomputing it on the fly. I also removed all the subpixel reads and writes. The subpixel reads and writes by themselves were not particularly slow, but the benefit was actually pretty much zero, because even with that subpixel addressing, you ended up with formations that were sort of subgrid scale and it looked jagged. And so I needed to blur the final results anyway. And so there was really just no benefit. And so by removing the subpixel reads and writes, it sped it up a little bit. Furthermore, one of the common operations inside the algorithm is to use the floor operator, which is to say, if you have a floating point number and you want to just lop off the decimal, there's a function for that called floor, and it turns out to run really slowly. So it's really easy to just implement that as a cast to an integer, as long as you do it carefully, and that ended up saving something like 12% of the processing time. It was really expensive. Anyway, so the new algorithm ran faster, and the results looked okay. But, wait for it. Wait for it. You're supposed to be impressed by how good it looks. Now here you can see the tank driving on the alluvial plain, and they're still too bumpy. So even though the alluvial plains formed, and I had nice tall cliffs that created barriers, I just didn't have the smooth driving I was looking for. So I needed to try something else. So here's the problem. I wanted smoother smooth regions, but leave the bumpy regions still bumpy. So the cliffs are where we want them, and we have flat-ish alluvial plains. I just want smoother alluvial plains. So the idea was to quantify bumpiness, and to do that I just compute the standard deviation of a k by k kernel and normalize that to the range 0 to 1. Then I compute a blurred version of the terrain heights to have a smooth version. And then as the final step, I blend between the smooth terrain and the original unsmooth terrain, using that normalized standard deviation as a blend weight or a mask. So here's the height field of the base fractal terrain that the diamond square algorithm generates. And this is the deviance field from that base fractal terrain. Here is the height field of the terrain after running hydraulic erosion. And this is the deviance field from that eroded terrain. Note that most of the terrain is mostly smooth already. I just want to further smooth just that part and not touch any of the bumpy parts, which are in white here. This shows a mask where only the smoothest 12% of the terrain gets blurred. This choice of 12% yields a good balance of smooth pathways and bumpy barriers. For comparison, this shows the mask using a threshold of 10%. It leaves too much bumpy terrain. And a threshold of 15% makes too much smooth terrain. So 12% seems to be the Goldilocks value. The combination of hydraulic erosion and deviance masked smoothing resulted in a terrain that looks interesting and has drivable terrain despite the computational shortcuts. This shows the tank driving easily on a smooth beach region. And then, wait for it. Wait for it. He's going to round this corner. And then what's he going to do? He's going to try to take a shortcut and just go straight up that hill. And he's struggling. He can't get up that bumpy hillside all that easily. So this is the balance that I wanted. Smooth pathways segregated by difficult barriers. This breaks up the terrain and makes it seem larger than it is. So great. Now the player faces this terrain that has contrasting easy pathways and challenging barriers. But what about the AI? So now the player expects the AI to continue to follow him, but without any tweaks, the AI don't yet know how to find that smooth pathway. So they ended up getting stuck and left behind. So I didn't want to postpone checking this terrain stuff in. So for just like a shortcut, I just boosted the amount of thrust that the AI has, and so they can go over terrain easily. But as that video just showed, like they still have some silly behaviors. So I will definitely have to come back and revisit how the AI copes with this terrain. So in summary, I wanted to have the players feel like they had a sense that the planet is larger than it is. So I added hydraulic erosion, which created these striking barriers without polygonal artifacts that I got from the fractal algorithm. And I added deviance weighted smoothing, which smoothed the pathways that formed from the hydraulic erosion, and that led to easier driving in the places where I wanted driving to be easier. So I'll declare this success. Players have to be deliberate about the path that they choose, but I still have some future work to do because the AI are not yet making a distinction between these two different kinds of terrain. So anyway, that's all I have for this time. I welcome feedback about what to keep, what to stop, and what to start with these videos, and so please let me know what you think. Also, subscribe if you want to get notified of future updates, and I'll post some links here for other content you might enjoy if you like this video. Thanks a lot.